I promised a fresh pasta video with my last video, and here it is. You're going to start by mixing 5 egg yolks, or 90 grams of yolks, with 1 whole egg, 3 grams of salt, a half teaspoon of milk, and 2 teaspoons of olive oil. Then you're going to take 250 grams of preferably tipo 00 flour, but I ran out so I'm using AP here. Build a well in a bowl, and then pour your egg mixture in that well. You see a lot of people doing this step on the counter, but I prefer to start off in a bowl because it makes things less messy. And then with a fork, you're going to mix in your flour with the egg mixture. And at this point, the mixture is dry enough that you can start kneading with your hands in the bowl. And then once it starts to become even more cohesive, I dump it on the table and start mixing and kneading with my hands on the counter. At this point, the flour is almost all incorporated, but you can see there's still some flour on the table that I wanted to incorporate, so I added like a teaspoon of water to make that easier. You don't really want to add a lot of water because your dough is going to be too wet. The dough is pretty well incorporated. There's a few dry spots here and there, but at this point, I'm going to stop and wrap it in plastic wrap and let the dough rest on the counter for an hour. This lets the flour fully hydrate and it'll make it easier to knead. So here the dough is rested for an hour. I'm going to unwrap it, and as you can see, it already looks wetter. I do a trick and wet my hands before kneading the dough a second time so that it makes the kneading process just a little bit easier. Again, you don't want to add a lot of water, but just a little bit goes a long way. You're going to keep kneading, and you want eventually the dough to be a smooth, uniform ball with no dry spots. And then once you feel like you've reached that consistency, you're going to form it into a ball and then wrap it in that plastic wrap again. And this time you're going to let it rest for at least 6 hours in the fridge, preferably overnight. Now it's the next day and you've started rolling out your dough. I usually let it sit on the counter for about 30 minutes so it's easier to roll out. And then you're just going to begin to roll out the dough. I'm putting down a little bit of flour, but you really don't need a lot. If you have a pasta machine, now is a great time to use it, but I don't. And honestly, if you're only making pasta for 2 people, it's really not that hard to roll it out by hand. And once you get it out to a decent length, maybe 1.5 feet, you can start doing your folds. So the first fold, I just did a simple fold one side over the other to make like a nice rectangle, and then continue rolling it out. Whether you're using a pasta machine or rolling by hand like I am, it's important to do the folds because that's how you're going to get the nice chewy noodle texture that you want in the final pasta. And there I just did my second fold, and in total you're going to want to do at least 3 folds. Just rolling it out longer and longer each time, and then doing a couple folds to bring it back to a rectangular shape. And if you ever feel like you're rolling and it's just not getting any longer, you can always put a towel over the dough and let it rest on your counter for 10 minutes, come back to it, and it'll be way easier. Now you can start to see my fingers behind the dough, but it's not transparent at all. It still has a little bit of thickness to it, and at this point you're gonna start cutting your noodles. I trim the edges, fold it in half so it's easier to trim the edge. I would recommend putting semolina in between the folds before you fold it down so it doesn't stick to itself. I didn't do that because I was silly, but my dough was also pretty dry, so I felt like I didn't need to. And then I made pappardelle, so I cut pretty thick pieces. And once you have your noodles all cut, you're going to want to coat them all evenly in semolina so they don't stick together. And then if you're waiting to cook them, don't let them dry out and cover them with a towel. And there you have it, fresh noodles. They take some time, but they're definitely worth it.